Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when the noise around us is so loud that we forget how powerful a single, clear voice can be. We wake up to demands, pressures, disappointments, and expectations, and somewhere in the middle of all that, we begin to wonder if God is still speaking or if he has gone quiet. But what if the silence you feel is not absence at all? What if it is the sacred pause before something weighty, something personal, something life-shaping is about to be spoken directly to you from the very beginning? God has been a communicator, not distant, not detached, but intentional and relational. He speaks purpose into chaos, identity into uncertainty, and hope into places where fear once had authority. Yet so often we assume that his voice is reserved for the extraordinary, for the spiritually elite, or for some future version of ourselves that has it all together. The truth is far more beautiful and far more urgent. God speaks to ordinary people in ordinary moments, and he does it with extraordinary love. Right now, in this very season of your life, God has something important to say to you. Not a generic message, not a recycled phrase, but a word that meets you where you are and calls you into where you are meant to be. His voice does not come to condemn or confuse. It comes to awaken, to align, and to remind you of who you truly are. When God speaks, he does not merely inform the mind, he transforms the heart. Many people are searching for direction, praying for clarity, longing for reassurance, unaware that God has already been speaking gently, persistently, faithfully. Sometimes the issue is not that God is silent, but that we have not slowed down enough to listen. Sometimes his voice comes as a whisper that requires trust rather than proof, faith rather than control. Today is not about information, it is about invitation. An invitation to tune your heart, to lift your expectation, and to recognize that heaven is not distant. God is near, he is attentive, and he is intentional. What he wants to say to you carries the power to shift how you see yourself, how you see your future, and how you walk forward from this moment. God is still speaking even when life feels noisy and confusing, and this truth confronts one of the greatest struggles of the human heart. We live surrounded by constant sound, endless information, opinions, alerts, and expectations pulling at our attention from every direction. In the middle of this chaos, it becomes easy to assume that if God were truly speaking, his voice would rise above everything else, loud and unmistakable. But God has never competed with noise. He invites us out of it. The confusion we feel is not proof that God is distant. It is often evidence that we are living in a world that has forgotten how to listen. Many people mistake emotional overload for spiritual silence. When prayers seem unanswered and circumstances feel overwhelming, the mind concludes that God has stopped communicating. Yet God's voice is not dependent on our clarity. It is constant, steady, and intentional. He speaks in ways that require relationship rather than demand attention. His voice carries peace even when everything around us feels unstable. But peace can be difficult to recognize when we are addicted to urgency and pressure. The noise of fear, doubt, and distraction can drown out what God is already saying. Not because his voice is weak, but because it is gentle and rooted in love. Throughout history, God has spoken most clearly in moments of disorder. When hearts were uncertain, when people felt lost, when the future seemed unclear, that was often when his voice carried the greatest weight. He speaks into confusion not to add complexity, but to bring alignment. His words cut through chaos with truth, reminding us that uncertainty does not cancel purpose. Even when life feels loud and directionless, God is still shaping, guiding, and calling, often speaking in ways that bypass the intellect and settle directly into the spirit. There is a difference between hearing sound and hearing meaning. God is not trying to overwhelm us with information. He is drawing us into understanding. He speaks through moments of stillness, through scripture that suddenly feels alive, through an inner knowing that cannot be explained logically, through peace that arrives without permission from circumstances. While the world shouts for our attention, God waits for our trust. His voice does not rush us, it restores us. It does not accuse, it affirms. It does not increase confusion, it brings clarity even if the situation remains unresolved. Sometimes the noise is not external at all. It is internal, made up of regret, fear of failure, and the pressure to have everything figured out. These inner voices can be louder than any external distraction, convincing us that we are disqualified from hearing God clearly. Yet God's voice has never been limited by human weakness. He speaks to people in process, people with questions, people who are still learning how to trust. Confusion does not intimidate him. It invites his involvement. God is not waiting for life to become quiet before he speaks. He speaks now, in the middle of responsibilities, disappointments, and unanswered questions. His voice brings direction without anxiety and assurance without explanation. When we learn to quiet our hearts instead of demanding quiet circumstances, we begin to recognize that God has been communicating all along. The noise does not have the final word. Confusion does not have authority. God's voice remains present, faithful, and purposeful, calling us not to panic, but to listen, not to strive, but to trust, not to assume silence, but to believe that even now, even here, God is still speaking to those willing to tune their hearts beyond the noise and lean into the certainty that his voice is closer than they think, shaping thoughts, steadying emotions, and inviting them into a deeper awareness of his presence in the midst of everything they are facing and everything they're becoming. Silence does not mean absence. It often precedes revelation. And this truth challenges the way many people interpret God's ways. In a world trained to measure value by immediate response and constant feedback, silence feels uncomfortable, even threatening. When nothing seems to be happening, the heart assumes something is wrong. Yet throughout spiritual history, silence has never been a sign that God has withdrawn. More often, it is the space where depth is formed, where trust is tested, and where revelation is prepared beneath the surface. Silence has a way of exposing what we truly believe about God. If we think his presence depends on constant signs and audible reassurance, silence feels like abandonment. But if we understand that God is intentional, silence becomes an invitation. It slows us down, strips away distractions, and reveals what noise has been covering. In the quiet, motives surface, fears rise, and expectations are refined. God does not waste silence. He uses it to realign hearts that have become dependent on clarity rather than trust. Many of the most significant breakthroughs are born in seasons where nothing appears to be moving. Behind the stillness, something is being formed that could not survive exposure too early. Just as seeds develop underground long before they break through the soil, revelation often matures in silence before it becomes visible. The absence of immediate answers is not delay, it is development. God is not withholding truth. He is preparing the heart to receive it without misusing it. Silence teaches listening on a deeper level. When familiar voices fade, the heart becomes more sensitive. Expectations shift from control to surrender. In that place, revelation does not arrive as noise, but as clarity. It does not rush in, it settles in. What God reveals after silence often carries more weight, more precision, and more lasting impact than anything delivered in haste. Silence creates room for God to speak in ways that reshape identity rather than simply solve problems. There are moments when God allows silence to remove dependency on external validation. When prayers are met with stillness, the heart learns to trust God for who he is, not just for what he does. Silence confronts impatience and exposes areas where faith has been built on outcomes rather than relationship. In that space, faith deepens, not because answers arrive, but because confidence in God's character grows stronger. Silence also protects revelation. Some truths are too powerful to be released before the heart is ready to steward them. God often waits until pride softens, until fear loosens its grip, until the heart is willing to obey without needing full understanding. Silence becomes the refining fire that prepares the vessel. When revelation finally comes, it does not overwhelm, it aligns. It feels familiar, as though the heart has been hearing it long before the words arrive. What feels like emptiness is often fullness and preparation. God's silence is never passive. It is intentional, active, and purposeful. While the surface feels still, his work continues beneath awareness, shaping perspective, strengthening endurance, and anchoring faith deeper than emotion. Silence teaches the heart to rest, not because everything makes sense, but because God remains trustworthy even when explanations are absent. When revelation follows silence, it carries authority. It does not need to announce itself loudly because it resonates deeply. It answers questions the heart has not yet learned to articulate. It brings peace without requiring evidence and direction, without pressure. Those who learn not to fear silence begin to recognize it as sacred space, a threshold where God prepares to reveal what could not be heard amid noise, what could not be received without stillness, and what could not be understood without first learning to trust him when nothing seemed to be happening at all. God's voice brings identity, not condemnation, and this truth reshapes the way we understand how he speaks to the human heart. Many people assume that when God speaks, it will sound like accusation, highlighting failure, weakness, or everything that still needs to be fixed. That expectation often comes from a lifetime of criticism, comparison, and performance-based acceptance. Yet God does not speak to shame people into change. He speaks to reveal who they truly are. His voice does not press down on the soul. It lifts the head and restores clarity about identity. Condemnation always points backward, replaying mistakes and defining a person by their lowest moments. God's voice, however, points forward. It does not ignore sin or brokenness, but addresses them from the position of redemption rather than rejection. When God speaks, he separates behavior from identity. He corrects without crushing, convicts without humiliating, and calls people higher without reminding them of how low they have been. His voice carries truth wrapped in love, not judgment disguised as holiness. Identity is the foundation of transformation. God does not begin by telling people what to do. He begins by revealing who they are. Before a sign, hence come affirmation. Before direction comes belonging. When God speaks, he anchors the heart in sonship, purpose, and value. This is why his voice brings freedom rather than fear. Fear thrives where identity is uncertain, but when God speaks, clarity replaces confusion. The heart no longer strives to earn approval because it has received acceptance. Many people confuse the voice of God with the voice of guilt. Guilt is loud, repetitive, and exhausting. It pressures, accuses, and offers no solution. God's voice is steady, specific, and restorative. It brings awareness without despair. It exposes what needs healing while simultaneously revealing the grace to walk through that process. Where condemnation says, "You are the problem," God's voice says, "You are my child, and I am working with you." God speaks identity, especially in moments when people feel unworthy to hear him. When shame says withdrawal is required, God speaks nearness. When failure says disqualification, God speaks calling. His voice often contradicts internal narratives shaped by past wounds, rejected dreams, and unmet expectations. He speaks truth into those places, not to dismiss pain, but to redefine reality. Identity spoken by God has the power to interrupt cycles of self-sabotage and spiritual insecurity. When God speaks identity, it aligns the heart with heaven's perspective rather than human opinion. The world labels people by success, status, or mistakes, but God names people by purpose. His words do not fluctuate with performance. He does not speak differently on good days and bad days. His voice remains consistent because his view of the person remains secure. That consistency builds confidence that is not dependent on circumstances. God's voice also restores identity that has been buried under expectations and disappointments. Many people live disconnected from who they were created to be, shaped more by survival than calling. When God speaks, he awakens dormant purpose. His words remind the heart of original design, not just current condition. Identity spoken by God has a creative power. It calls forth what is hidden, strengthens what is weak, and stabilizes what has been shaken. Correction from God never attacks identity. It protects it. He addresses areas that threaten alignment, not to reject the person, but to preserve who they truly are. His voice does not say, "You are not enough." It says, "You were made for more." That distinction changes everything. Instead of hiding from God, the heart runs toward him. Instead of fear, there is trust. Instead of striving, there is rest. When God speaks, the soul recognizes truth, not because it is harsh, but because it resonates deeply, confirming what the heart has always longed to believe about itself, about God, and about the relationship that was never meant to be defined by condemnation, but by identity spoken in love. He speaks personally, not generically, to every heart. And this truth reveals how deeply intentional God is in his communication. Many people assume that if God speaks, his words must be broad, universal statements meant for everyone in the same way. While his truth is consistent, his voice is personal. God does not mass-produce messages. He customizes them. He knows the history, the questions, the wounds, and the hopes of each heart. And he speaks with precision that cannot be replicated by generalized language. A personal word from God has a way of reaching places no public message ever could. It carries familiarity, as though it recognizes the listener before the listener fully understands what is being said. God's voice meets people in their unique circumstances, addressing not only what is happening on the surface, but what is unfolding internally. Two people can hear the same truth, yet God applies it differently, touching individual fears, dreams, and decisions in ways that feel unmistakably specific. God speaks personally because relationship requires recognition. He does not call people by category or comparison. He calls them by name. His voice affirms individuality rather than erasing it. While culture pressures people to conform, God speaks in ways that unlock authenticity. He does not speak to create replicas. He speaks to awaken original design. His words align with the unique calling placed within each person, confirming that no life is accidental and no journey is overlooked. Often, people miss God's voice because they're waiting for something dramatic, overlooking the subtle and personal ways he communicates. God may speak through a quiet impression, a verse that stands out, a thought that carries peace, or a repeated nudge that refuses to be ignored. These moments are not random. They are intentional points of connection where God engages the heart directly. What he says may not make sense to anyone else, and that is often the confirmation that it is personal. God's personal communication also brings responsibility. A word meant for one heart may not be meant for another. Comparison can distort what God is saying and create confusion. When people try to apply someone else's word to their own life, they risk missing what God is uniquely saying to them. Personal revelation requires humility, patience, and discernment. God speaks in ways that align with individual seasons, capacities, and growth, never rushing development or forcing outcomes. Personal words from God often address questions that have not been spoken out loud. They answer internal prayers, settle unexpressed fears, and bring clarity to hidden conflicts. This is why God's voice feels intimate. It reveals that he has been listening long before we learned how to ask. Communication does not begin with our words, it begins with his awareness. He speaks from a place of complete understanding, not partial observation. God speaks personally to heal as well as to guide. He addresses wounds with gentleness and restores hope without pressure. His words bring comfort that feels tailored rather than generic, reassurance that meets the heart exactly where it is. In moments of pain, a personal word from God can carry more healing than 1,000 explanations. It reminds the heart that it is seen, known, and valued. Personal communication from God also strengthens trust. When people recognize that God knows them individually, faith becomes relational rather than theoretical. God is no longer an idea or a distant authority. He becomes a present guide. His voice becomes recognizable over time, familiar in tone and consistent in character. The more the heart learns to listen, the clearer his personal communication becomes, shaping decisions, building confidence, and reinforcing the truth that God is not speaking in generalities, but is continually engaging each heart with intention, clarity, and care that cannot be mistaken for coincidence or chance. Ordinary moments are often the setting for divine messages, and this truth challenges the assumption that God only speaks in dramatic or extraordinary circumstances. Many people are waiting for a powerful encounter, a life-altering event, or a supernatural interruption before they believe God is speaking. Yet God has always been comfortable revealing himself in the familiar rhythms of daily life. He does not limit his voice to mountaintops or sacred gatherings. He speaks in kitchens, on quiet walks, during routine tasks, and in moments that seem unimportant by human standards. The problem is not that God is silent, but that expectations are often misplaced. When people look only for the spectacular, they overlook the sacred hidden in the ordinary. God's voice often comes woven into everyday experiences, disguised as thoughts that carry peace, moments that stir the heart, or simple insights that arrive without fanfare. These are not random impressions. They are intentional communications meant to be received without needing attention from others. Ordinary moments create the perfect environment for honesty. There is less pressure to perform, less distraction from image, and more room for authenticity. In these moments, the heart is open, defenses are lowered, and listening becomes natural rather than forced. God often chooses these times because the soul is not striving for an experience, but simply present. His voice flows where there is availability, not where there is spectacle. God speaks in ordinary moments because that is where life is actually lived. Decisions are made there. Character is formed there. Faith is practiced there. If God only spoke in extraordinary ways, his voice would feel disconnected from daily reality. Instead, he integrates his guidance into everyday life, teaching people how to recognize him in the simple and the familiar. His words bring meaning to routine, reminding the heart that no moment is wasted when God is involved. There is also a humility required to hear God in ordinary settings. Pride often expects God to speak in ways that elevate self-importance, while humility allows the heart to receive from unexpected places. God's voice does not seek attention, it seeks obedience. He speaks quietly, not because his message lacks power, but because he values relationship over display. Ordinary moments protect the purity of his communication, keeping it free from performance and comparison. Many people dismiss subtle promptings because they seem too simple to be divine. Yet simplicity has always been one of God's signatures. His voice often comes as a gentle redirection, a reminder, or a reassurance that feels natural rather than overwhelming. These small moments accumulate over time, shaping character and guiding direction more effectively than a single dramatic event ever could. Ordinary moments also reveal consistency. God does not speak once and disappear. He communicates continually, day by day, moment by moment. His presence is not seasonal or conditional. When people learn to recognize his voice in the everyday, faith becomes integrated into life rather than compartmentalized. God is no longer reserved for special occasions. He becomes part of every step, every choice, every response. God's voice in ordinary moments invites attentiveness. It teaches the heart to slow down, to notice and to listen beyond surface noise. The sacred often hides in simplicity because it requires intentional awareness to be discovered. When people begin to honor ordinary moments as potential meeting places with God, their perspective shifts. Life becomes filled with purpose, not because circumstances change, but because awareness deepens. What appears routine can become revelatory when the heart is listening. God's voice transforms the ordinary into something meaningful, not by altering the moment, but by revealing his presence within it. Over time, these everyday encounters build a deep, steady confidence that God is not distant or selective in his communication. He is consistently present, speaking life, guidance, and truth into the fabric of daily living, shaping faith not through rare events, but through a continuous, intimate conversation woven into the ordinary moments that make up life. Listening requires surrender, not perfection. And this truth removes one of the greatest barriers people face when trying to hear God. Many believe they must reach a certain level of spiritual maturity, discipline, or moral consistency before God will speak clearly to them. This mindset turns listening into a performance and creates anxiety around getting everything right. Yet God has never required perfection as the entry point for relationship. He invites hearts, not resumes. Surrender opens the door to his voice in ways striving never can. Perfection focuses on control, while surrender embraces trust. When people try to listen from a place of control, they filter everything through fear of being wrong, fear of misunderstanding, or fear of failure. That pressure clouds discernment. Surrender, on the other hand, quiets the heart. It releases the need to manage outcomes and allows God to lead without resistance. Listening becomes less about accuracy and more about availability. God speaks to willing hearts, not flawless ones. Throughout history, he has communicated with people who were uncertain, inconsistent, and still learning. Their qualification was not their perfection, but their openness. Surrender acknowledges human limitation and invites divine guidance. It says, I do not need to have it all figured out to follow. In that posture, the heart becomes teachable and God's voice becomes clearer. Many people hesitate to listen because they fear mishearing God and making mistakes. This fear often leads to inaction rather than wisdom. God is not threatened by our learning process. He guides gently, correcting with patience and clarity. Listening is a relationship skill that grows with trust, not a test that demands flawless execution. Surrender allows room for growth, adjustment, and understanding over time. Perfectionism often disguises itself as spirituality. It demands certainty before obedience and clarity before movement. Surrender reverses that order. It chooses obedience even when understanding is incomplete. God often speaks in ways that require faith, not full comprehension. Listening becomes an act of trust rather than analysis. When the heart releases the demand for perfection, it becomes more sensitive to God's leading. Surrender also involves letting go of preconceived ideas about how God should speak. When people insist on specific methods or signs, they limit their ability to hear. God's voice is relational, not mechanical. He speaks through impressions, scripture, peace, conviction, and circumstance, often blending them together. A surrendered heart remains flexible, willing to recognize God's voice in unexpected forms. Listening from surrender also requires humility. It accepts that personal desires, fears, and biases can influence perception. Instead of denying this reality, surrender places those influences before God. It allows him to align motives and refine understanding. God does not withdraw his voice because of human weakness. He enters it to bring clarity. God's goal in speaking is not to trap people in error, but to lead them into truth. He values the journey of listening as much as the outcome. When people surrender the need to be perfect, they become or attentive, more responsive, and more at peace. Listening becomes a natural flow rather than a stressful effort. Surrender creates space for intimacy. It removes the pressure to impress and replaces it with trust. In that space, God's voice is recognized not by volume, but by resonance. It aligns with his character and produces peace even when direction challenges comfort. The heart learns that listening is not about achieving spiritual excellence, but about staying connected. When surrender becomes the posture, listening becomes relational rather than transactional. God is no longer a distant authority to decode, but a present guide to follow. His voice meets people where they are, not where they think they should be. The freedom of surrender allows listening to grow naturally, shaping faith through trust, responsiveness, and a willingness to follow even without complete understanding. knowing that God leads patiently and faithfully those who are willing to yield their hearts rather than striving to perfect themselves before they listen. Listening requires surrender, not perfection, and this truth confronts the pressure many people place on themselves when they desire to hear God clearly. There is a common belief that God only speaks to those who have mastered discipline, eliminated weakness, and reached a flawless spiritual state. This belief quietly turns listening into a test of worthiness rather than an active relationship. Instead of leaning in with trust, people hold back, convinced they must fix themselves before God will engage. Yet God has always spoken to imperfect hearts, not as a reward for behavior, but as an invitation into transformation. Perfection creates tension because it is rooted in fear of failure. When people aim for perfection, they listen with anxiety, constantly questioning whether they are hearing correctly or measuring up. That tension distorts perception. Surrender releases that pressure. It acknowledges human limitation and opens space for God's guidance without conditions. Listening becomes less about getting everything right and more about staying responsive and open. God's voice flows where control is released, not where it is tightly held. God is not waiting for people to become complete before he speaks. He speaks in order to complete what is lacking. Surrender allows the heart to admit need without shame. It creates honesty rather than performance. When people surrender, they stop pretending to have answers and start depending on God's wisdom. This dependence sharpens sensitivity to his voice because the heart is no longer cluttered with self-effort and self-evaluation. Many struggle to listen because they fear making mistakes. They believe one misstep will disqualify them or derail everything. This fear often leads to silence, not because God is not speaking, but because people are afraid to respond. Surrender changes this dynamic. It trusts God's ability to guide even when learning is involved. God corrects gently, redirects patiently, and teaches consistently. Listening is a process of relationship, not a one-time moment of perfection. Perfectionism often demands full clarity before obedience. Surrender chooses obedience even when clarity unfolds gradually. God frequently speaks in ways that require faith rather than certainty. He invites steps of trust that reveal understanding along the way. A surrendered heart is willing to move with partial insight, confident that God will continue to guide. This posture keeps the heart engaged rather than frozen by the need to be flawless. Surrender also frees people from rigid expectations about how God should communicate. When perfection controls listening, people often demand specific signs, emotions, or confirmations. Surrender remains flexible. It recognizes that God's voice can come through scripture, inner conviction, peace, wise counsel, or circumstances. A surrendered heart is attentive rather than demanding, responsive rather than controlling. Humility is central to surrender. It accepts that personal desires and fears can influence interpretation. Instead of denying this, surrender brings those influences before God and asks for alignment. God does not reject people for their weakness. He meets them there. His voice brings adjustment without condemnation, clarity without shame. God's purpose in speaking is not to expose failure, but to build trust. When people surrender the need to be perfect, they experience freedom in listening. The pressure lifts and attentiveness increases. God's voice becomes recognizable not because it meets human standards of certainty, but because it carries peace, alignment, and truth. Surrender transforms listening from a stressful pursuit into a relational exchange where God leads patiently and faithfully, shaping hearts through trust rather than demanding flawlessness before he speaks. God's words carry power to realign purpose and direction, and this truth speaks to the deep confusion many people experience when life no longer seems to make sense. There are seasons when plans fall apart, motivation fades, and the future feels uncertain. In those moments, people often search for strategies, advice, or external validation to regain control. Yet what the heart truly needs is not more information, but alignment. When God speaks, his words do more than encourage. They recalibrate the inner compass that guides decisions, priorities, and identity. Misalignment does not always come from rebellion. Often it comes from distraction. Life gradually pulls attention away from purpose through responsibility, pressure, and compromise. Without realizing it, people begin moving in directions that look productive but feel empty. God's voice interrupts that drift. It brings clarity without confusion and direction without force. His words do not overwhelm with detail, they restore focus. When God speaks, scattered thoughts begin to organize around truth, and the heart remembers why it was created. God's word has creative power. Just as spoken words shape environments and influence behavior, God's words shape destiny. When he speaks, something shifts internally. Old patterns lose authority, and new possibilities emerge. His voice realigns desire with design. People often discover that what once felt important no longer holds the same weight. While neglected, passions resurface with renewed clarity. This is not emotional impulse. It is spiritual alignment taking place beneath awareness. Direction from God is not about rigid control, but relational guidance. He does not force movement, he invites response. His words illuminate the next step rather than revealing the entire path. This protects trust and dependence. Realignment happens as people respond to what God is saying now, not by trying to predict what comes later. His voice stabilizes the present moment, allowing the future to unfold with purpose rather than anxiety. God's words also realign perspective. When circumstances dominate vision, people begin interpreting life through limitation and fear. God speaks to lift vision beyond immediate challenges. He reminds the heart of eternal purpose, helping people see beyond temporary setbacks. This shift in perspective changes how problems are approached. Obstacles become opportunities for growth rather than signs of failure. Direction returns not because circumstances change, but because understanding deepens. Realignment often begins internally before it becomes visible externally. God addresses beliefs, motives, and attitudes before altering circumstances. His words expose areas where compromise has quietly redirected focus, not to condemn, but to restore alignment with truth. This internal adjustment produces peace even when outward situations remain unresolved. The heart knows it is moving in the right direction, even if progress feels slow. God's voice brings courage to change course when necessary. Realignment sometimes requires letting go of paths that once made sense. Fear resists this, clinging to familiarity. God's words provide the confidence to release what no longer aligns with purpose. His guidance does not shame the past, it redeems it. He uses previous experiences as preparation rather than regret. When God speaks, direction becomes simpler. Complexity fades because purpose clarifies priorities. Decisions are no longer driven by pressure or comparison, but by alignment with what God is saying. His words act as a compass, steady and reliable, guiding the heart back to center. Purpose is not reinvented, it is remembered. God's words carry authority because they originate from truth. They do not fluctuate with emotion or circumstance. When people allow his voice to realign them, they experience a renewed sense of direction that feels both grounding and freeing. Life begins to move with intention rather than urgency. Even in uncertainty, there is confidence that each step matters. That direction is unfolding as the heart listens, responds, and aligns itself with the voice that knows the beginning and the end, continually drawing purpose and direction back into harmony with his design. When God speaks, transformation begins in the heart, and this truth reveals where real change actually takes place. Many people look for transformation in external circumstances, believing that if situations improve, peace will follow. Yet God begins his work internally. Before behavior shift, before direction change, Before breakthroughs become visible, God speaks to the heart. His words reach deeper than surface change. They touch motives, beliefs, and identity, creating transformation that is lasting rather than temporary. The heart is the center of perception. It shapes how people interpret life, respond to challenges, and make decisions. When God speaks, he addresses this core. His voice brings light to hidden areas, not to expose for shame, but to heal and restore. Transformation starts when truth replaces distortion. God's words dismantle lies that have quietly shaped identity and replace them with clarity that brings freedom. External change without internal transformation leads to exhaustion. People try to modify behavior through effort and discipline alone, only to find themselves returning to old patterns. God's voice works differently. It changes desire before action. When the heart is transformed, obedience flows naturally rather than through pressure. God does not force transformation. He invites it by revealing truth that the heart willingly embraces. God's words carry authority because they align with reality. When he speaks, confusion begins to lose its grip. Fear that once felt justified starts to fade. His voice brings peace that does not depend on understanding every detail. This peace guards the heart, stabilizing emotions and restoring confidence. Transformation is not always dramatic. Often it is quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. The heart also holds memories of pain, disappointment, and unmet expectations. God speaks into these places with compassion. His words do not deny pain, they redefine its power. What once controlled reactions begins to lose influence. Healing becomes possible not because circumstances change, but because the heart receives truth that reframes experience. Transformation unfolds as wounds are met with grace rather than avoidance. God's voice also awakens faith within the heart. Faith is not blind optimism. It is trust grounded in truth. When God speaks, faith rises naturally. The heart begins to expect good because it has encountered God's character. This expectation changes how people approach challenges. Instead of reacting from fear, they respond from trust. Transformation shows itself in posture before it appears in outcome. As the heart transforms, perception shifts. What once seemed overwhelming becomes manageable. What once felt meaningless gains purpose. God's words reorder priorities, aligning the heart with what truly matters. This internal shift produces external fruit over time. Relationships change, decisions mature, and direction stabilizes, not because of forced effort, but because the heart has been reshaped by truth. Transformation in the heart also brings consistency. Emotions no longer dominate direction. God's voice provides an anchor that holds steady through highs and lows. The heart learns to remain aligned even when circumstances fluctuate. This stability is evidence of genuine transformation. It reflects a deep-rooted change that cannot be easily shaken. When God speaks, transformation does not happen all at once, but it begins decisively. A seed is planted in the heart that continues to grow. Over time, that seed shapes thoughts, influences choices, and guides responses. God's voice initiates a process that continues long after the moment of hearing. The heart becomes a place where truth lives, faith grows, and transformation unfolds continually, reshaping life from the inside out as the heart remains open, receptive, and responsive to the voice that speaks life, direction, and lasting change.